So it's 11 a.m. in the Pacific time zone, and so I will get started. We want to start on time so that we can get through our agenda. Welcome to the RSG webinar on counting our communities. The LGBTQ plus population makes up around 6% of the US population and has not been evaluated as a disadvantaged community to evaluate the equity transportation investments for this population. RSG has organized this webinar to highlight this gap in research and identify ways we can better understand and represent the LGBTQ population. By creating a space to discuss LGBTQ plus identities in travel behavior data collection and modeling, we hope to advance the industry conversation around inclusive decision-making at the federal, state, and local levels. The panel we have put together includes academic, industry, and public sector experts on inclusive practices for travel behavior data collection and modeling. We support recent legislation to add sexual orientation and gender identity questions to the census, which was introduced by the LGBTQ Data Inclusion Act and is currently in Congress. My name is Maren Outwater and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm a principal at RSG in San Diego, and I have both personal and professional interest in this topic. I'm pleased to be the moderator for Counting Our Communities, and I will ask our panel also to introduce themselves. Now, starting with Michael Smart.
Thank you, Maren. Let me start sharing my screen. I've got a... No, not yet.
Yes, just introduce yourself.
Right. Yeah, so I'm Michael Smart. I'm an associate professor at the Blaustein School of Urban Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University, and I do research, among other things, on the travel behavior of LGBT plus populations. My pronouns are he and him.
Anita?
Hello, everybody. My name is Anita Yap Kehilani, and my pronouns are she, her, and they. And I am the owner of Multicultural Collaborative here in Portland, Oregon. The work I do, I've got over 25 years working in local government, regional and state government, and transportation, housing, health equity, and environmental quality. And in particular, the focus of my consulting work is to center racial equity and other historically excluded communities into public policy, urban design, master planning, and engagement. And thank you for having me.
Great. Brian?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Lee. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I'm the Data Solutions and Research Manager at the Puget Sound Regional Council, which is a metropolitan planning organization for the greater four-county Seattle region. At PSRC, I've been managing the last three waves of our household travel survey program, and I'm a data lead in developing tools and data products to help a whole variety of social equity work programs.
Thanks. Mark?
Hello, I'm Mark Bradley, Senior Director at RSG. I'm also he, him, his, and I've been doing travel behavior research, modeling, and also survey design for RSG for about 10 years now, and working at other places for about 20 years before that.
Thanks. Now, to kick things off, we wanted to start with a couple of polls. We'd like to ask those in attendance to get a sense for how sexual orientation and gender identity questions come up in our work or research. So the first question is, have you ever completed a survey from a public agency that asked sexual orientation or gender identity questions? And the second question is, have you ever worked on a survey that asked sexual orientation or gender identity questions? And so if you could please answer the polls, we'd be appreciative, and then we'll share the results after we hear from two of our panelists. So we'll leave this up for a couple minutes to let everybody answer the panel. Great. So leave this question up for a minute. Okay, thank you for that. So first off, we have Professor Michael Smart, who's going to share some of his findings from a recent analysis of the role of neighborhoods of affinity in shaping travel choices.
Great, thank you. Waiting for my screen to share, and there we go. So hi, everyone. I am Michael Smart. Oh, I can't go into presenter view. Well, we can, in a pinch, we can keep it as is. Why don't we do that? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research, my own work with collaborators, and then work from other folks as well. Just there's not very much research on the travel behavior of LGBTQ plus populations. We're a very small community. I'm very excited to be here because something like 150 people have registered for this, so it means that somebody's at least interested in the topic, which I feel like I've been doing work in this area and nobody likes to listen to me about it, so it's very exciting. So why do we bother studying LGBTQ plus travel behavior? As Maren said, about 6% of Americans identify as LGBTQ. And for planning purposes and transportation purposes, a key part of that is that there is, I think we all know, significant clustering in space. So there are gay and lesbian neighborhoods in different metropolitan areas. And also a really underexplored topic is gay and lesbian towns. So not neighborhoods within a large metropolitan area, but sort of enclaves or exclaves in all around the country, really. There are some. And there's some evidence, this is work I've done with a couple of different collaborators, that LGBTQ people, particularly when they live in these queer enclaves, exhibit really distinct activity patterns and distinct travel patterns as well. There's a little bit of research, a little bit of writing and journalistic writing and other writing on some of the unique issues around queer populations moving through space, and that's particularly around harassment, and particularly around harassment both on the street as a pedestrian and in transit vehicles. So a number of important issues that relate to this topic. So what do we know about LGBTQ neighborhoods? This has been explored and researched pretty well. It's sort of underwhelming because the data quality is just not that great. But we do know that gay men in particular, lesbian couples to a lesser extent, somewhat lesser extent. We don't have much information on trans populations, and anyone who, I'll talk about this later, anyone who's not coupled, we rarely have data on them. But what we do see is overrepresentation in dense urban cores with older housing stock. It's about twice as dense on average as straight couples in this case it would be, and about twice as great a percentage of housing as pre-World War II. By all metrics, these are more walkable and transit-friendly areas, and particularly again for rental properties, and particularly for gay men living in rental properties, there's a preponderance of mixed-use development in the neighborhood. What we've seen is that there's been significant dispersion or some dispersion, I would say, over time. This is particularly true for homeowners in this population. And this is connected very, very much so to concerns in these various communities regarding gentrification and the threat to traditional enclaves, the West Hollywoods, the Chelseas, the what have you of the United States. And how my research collaborators and I have conceptualized this is that we in the planning world oftentimes will think about neighborhoods primarily through the lens of the built environment, right? So we're tied to our neighborhood through the sort of arrangement of stuff in the neighborhood. Sociologists and other folks who are interested in neighborhoods think primarily through the lens of connections between people. Now, these aren't hard and fast rules. Planners, of course, think about people, and sociologists think about built environment. And this is sort of two different lenses for coming at the idea, the notion of what makes a neighborhood a neighborhood. We're hoping, and this is, many people hope to do this. I'm not claiming to be the first or anything, but to really integrate these two approaches and think about the neighborhoods both as a collection of things in space, but also people and their relationships between one another. And so I've explored both LGBTQ neighborhoods and immigrant enclaves and have some interest. Sadly, the data are lacking in looking at religious enclaves as well. So case study, and I'm going to switch now to a video in just 1 second. We did in Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas, we mapped out thousands of different real estate advertisements that were targeted to the LGBTQ population by posting in the Dallas Voice. And many of these were advertisements that made very clear that these were aimed at primarily at gay men in this newspaper. A lot of clustering in the CBD, again, high density, mixed use, transit rich, walkable for Dallas. And we saw some dispersion, particularly for homeowners during the period roughly of the housing bubble and then reconcentration after that. So I'm going to switch to showing a video now, and I will hope that it works.
Oh, Michael, can you unmute yourself? I think it automatically muted you.
You're still muted, Michael.
I don't know if it muted me again or what. Now can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, you've just watched the video. These are bars for rent properties and for sale properties in Dallas, Fort Worth over time. And it shows that there is, during this period of the housing bubble, a great expansion of space that's being advertised, targeted toward, particularly, again, gay men in Dallas, and then a reconcentration in later years. And this is mirrored with census data as well. We'll talk about data in just a second. The census data are, we're trying to triangulate, essentially, because no data set is perfect, and they're all very imperfect, in fact. Okay, let me switch back to sharing my normal screen. And there we go. All right. And I'm not muted. Great. So getting right into the topic of data, what we tend to do, what a lot of researchers do who are interested in LGBT populations, if you don't have the means to collect your own data, which few do, is to rely on the census. And the census allows us to look just at same-sex coupled partners. The only way that you can determine or estimate what a person's sexual identity is, sexual orientation is by whether they say that they are cohabiting with a partner, which is distinct from a roommate, and that person that they are cohabiting with is the same sex. There are some major issues with this. Obviously, we're missing any non-partnered folks. We're missing the census-shy folks, and that is quite skewed. So folks of color, lower income people are less likely to feel comfortable telling the government essentially that they're LGBTQ+, right? And then another sort of wonkier problem is that even really small errors, rates of error among, for example, roommates, say 2 straight male roommates, could end up leading to really significant noise in the data. There have been estimates that this could be a really major problem. A very large population of 2 people of the same sex living together who are not coupled, if even a small fraction of those folks check the wrong box on the census, that could really pollute the data, and we think it does. Travel data are nearly non-existent. We're using, again, the same-sex partnerships in the traditional data sets, the census obviously, but also the NHTS and other data sets. We've used the American Time Use Survey as well. Some of these have large enough samples to work with and many do not. So we've worked with some data sets over the years that seem promising. We could, in theory, test some really interesting hypotheses and understand what's going on. But it turns out that there are only 30 people who, essentially told us that they were LGBTQ in the survey. So we can't move forward with that, of course. So what we do know is that regardless of income, gay men travel by transit really much more than straight men do, about 3 times as much. They walk and cycle at about 1.5 times the rate. And this is, again, even controlling for location, for age, for income, for a whole suite of control variables. So it's not just that these gay men that we're looking at are living in the dense urban core, it's something in addition to that. So they're traveling by transit much more than even their straight neighbors who live, above them in the apartment building or something like that. We also know that gay men in particular have much shorter or considerably shorter commute times. That ranges, depending on where we look, at 5 to 15% shorter than do straight men and lesbians. This is, again, remarkable for the fact that many of these folks live in dense urban cores where commutes tend to be a bit longer, in fact, in time. Trip distance, gay men and lesbians travel far fewer miles for shopping trips, for family personal trips, and social recreational purposes. We hypothesize and have some evidence for the fact that this may be due to just having strong ties to establishments in the neighborhood, having friends in the neighborhood, feeling some sense of connection to various shops and institutions in the neighborhood. And then a very interesting and underexplored aspect is when we look at household serving travel, so chauffeuring children, getting groceries, getting that dry cleaning and all that stuff. Gay and especially lesbian couples tend to share those responsibilities more equally than do straight couples. So there's more kind of task sharing in that travel, household serving travel area. Now, this is just a graph from one of our studies looking at as the percent of the census tract where people live increases from 0% same-sex partnered up to a maximum of about 15. That's about the maximum in the country. That there's a slight effect on the non-work trip distances for straight men. Not slight, I would say that's a pretty big effect. So those straight men living in traditional gayborhoods or queer neighborhoods do travel shorter distances, something around, at the maximum 20x% fewer miles. Women, both straight and lesbian, they are statistically indistinguishable from one another in this data set, at least, in regards to their travel, or slightly less, right? So their travel, regardless of where they live, are fewer miles for non-work trips. And then we see for gay men in particular that the effect is much, much stronger, and that gay men living in the traditional queer neighborhoods are traveling much shorter distances for non-work travel. So that's something like on the order of about 70% fewer miles of travel for, again, this is non-work travel. I'm going to show you the same graph, but for work trips. Straight men, no effect. Women, sort of, again, relatively constant, no effect of living in a queer neighborhood. And then again, for gay men, a very strong effect. So we see, and this is in a number of the studies that we've looked at, that these phenomena are particularly strong for gay men, that there is stronger clustering, that there's stronger travel effects among gay men than among partnered lesbians, with all the caveats I said about the quality of the data, right? The NHTS, the National Household Travel Survey, gives us some other evidence. It lines up really well. So we see twice as much walking, 8 times as much transit use, and much less driving. And again, this is all controlling for income, age, location, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So compared to their similarly situated neighbors, 1 floor above them or whatever, they're still doing much more walking, transit, riding, and a lot less driving. So I'll conclude just with a couple of thoughts about this. Why study this? Why incorporate it into travel demand modeling? Why incorporate it into our ongoing analyses around equity and service provision and on and on and on. This is a significant population that has been overlooked. I think probably we all agree on that, or we wouldn't be on this webinar, I suppose. I've presented this before and have been told, this was at a job interview, in fact, why would you bother studying that? That's what, 5% of the population? I was aghast at that statement, but it's a significant population. It's nothing to sneeze at. So that's just simply one reason why we might be interested in studying it. The clustering in spaces is sort of heightens this, that there are neighborhoods in our regions that are going to be affected at a much greater magnitude than that sort of 6% that we see when we look at the national average, right? And then planning for LGBTQ populations, so intra-neighborhood connections, connections to institutions, walkability. And then if you sort of flip that around, there might be ways to learn from the sort of desirable aspects of the travel behavior of particularly of gay men again. They are exhibiting greener travel, more local connections. Can we learn from that and expand on that to understand what might nudge other folks to travel in greener ways? And I think there is, perhaps not for every single region in the country, but there might be, for many of them, an avenue here for improving travel forecasting by incorporating queer populations into traditional travel demand modeling. And our needs, again, are data. Our needs are outreach and engagement. I think a big problem is that we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what issues exist out there. And I'll say, I think I've been tasked with talking briefly about the Census Pulse survey, the new wave of the Pulse survey, which is conducted by the Census. It's not the Census, is collecting data on both travel and on sexual orientation and gender identity. It's very exciting. What I've seen so far, it's supposed to be released, I believe, tomorrow, is very geographically non-specific. So we can start to understand the travel of queer populations sort of in the United States, which could be of great service, and it could also be end up being not that helpful because, if we have a few hundred people scattered around the US, I'm not sure that we can make any strong conclusions about their travel, but that remains to be seen. I'll stop there and relinquish my control of the screen.
Thank you, Michael. If you have questions for Michael, please feel free to enter them in the chat or save them for our question and answer period, which is following the panel discussion. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce Anita Yap, who has recently completed a focus group on how to consider LGBTQ plus identities in transportation planning.
Thank you, Maren. So, hi, everyone. I held a focus group just because I wanted to really talk about not only the LGBTQ community, but the intersectional identities and how that affects transportation mode choice, travel behavior patterns, and sense of safety, and even asking them some ideas and suggestions on what would this look like. So if you want to share my slideshow, that would be great. There it is. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the focus group that I held the other day, and aren't they an amazing group of people there? And you notice I just asked them, what are their identities from their race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, and then if they have any sort of disability identities as well. And you can see, I don't see anybody saying that they are gay or lesbian, at least in this group, but there's a whole lot of other things there. So just to know that, if you ask those kind of questions, at least to this group here, that none of those kind of boxes fit them. And so just understand that it's dynamic as well, but they have a lot of things to share about that. Next slide. So I asked them a couple questions. One of them, what is their primary mode of transportation? And it's car, and then secondary bike, walk, public transit, and then Uber and Lyft as the last option. They all experience harassment and violence while traveling in the community. And here are some of their quotes. Uber and Lyft, I give a different address for them to drop me off so the drivers don't know where I live. I get harassed by them a lot of times. A lot of them say they actually look at the picture of the driver before they get an Uber or Lyft. And if it's a male in particular, a white male, they will find another driver. Another one about a queer woman of color traveling around town, just really trying to not look like they are able to be engaged, but also being really, really aware of what's going on around them. And then this one is a direct quote. My focus group dared me to share this. So it says, you can't create policies to prevent a-holes from being a-holes and sketchballs. So what really that meant, I said, well, what does that mean? And they said, well, really we want to say is cis, white, usually hetero men are the main problem of harassment and violence that we experience. I mean, story after story about not being able to be out in public with their partner and getting harassed. Some of the women who are, they say they're hetero passing will hail cabs for others because they just look like they're able to get a cab or other sorts of things like that. So I think in particular, their travel patterns and behaviors are really telling on the challenges that they deal with. So again, this intersectional identity of not only the LGBTQIA community, but also women of color or femmes or trans people in particular tend to be harassed at quite a higher level, at least from an anecdotal standpoint. So next slide. So I asked them, what sort of recommendations would you like to share with this group? And a lot of these folks in this group are advocates in the community. And so here are some to consider is you can't do transportation without including mental and behavioral health support considerations. And considering concepts of safety beyond white women's perception. What they say is that they're less concerned about homeless and people with mental health issues, but more concerned about what they said, white men really harassing and having violence on them. So there's, trans non-binary people, safety with law enforcement and hate crimes, and then enforcement and penalty. And this is a good one. Don't put bus stops near bars, because they said every time that they've had to wait for a bus by a bar, they've been harassed. Sidewalks and lighting, and again, just like Michael's kind of recommendation about gentrification and affordable housing and transportation is close in. So a couple takeaways related to this is that there are quite a few unique issues. One of our focus group members who is deaf and queer POCs have a more difficult time out in public, basically because they can't hear. If someone says something to them and they don't respond, they usually end up getting harassed or worse. So trans people in particular, because possibly with however they present either is a challenge for other folks, so just even the way they look can trigger violence and harassment. One other thing that they mentioned is that there are certain places in the neighborhood that they know are safe. And so like grocery stores, one of the focus group members said that, even though I travel all around the community for my work, I only go to certain places because I know the people there and it's safe. And so one of the recommendations is really providing some opportunities with businesses on, queer friendly types of things like that. But in particular, I think that's really important to think about. Last slide. Oregon actually has quite a few regulations and laws, and here's just a short list of them related to some of the legislation and the dates of that related to collecting SOGI data, in particular within universities, higher education, and then also public health. The most recent one, House Bill 3159, excuse me, takes effect September of this year. It's called Data Justice. And so it's really looking at, the real data is race, ethnicity, and language and disability, including SOGI data as well. So they're going through some rulemaking, and it's pretty exciting. There's also some other information on the slide deck, both on data collection and what sort of questions, because it's a big range of identities and preference, and I think it evolves as well. So I think we need to be really aware. But I think in particular, I just want to emphasize the intersectionality is really, really important as it comes to perceptions and also experiences of safety and travel behavior. So, thank you.
Thank you, Anita. I want to remind or tell everybody that the slides that were presented by Michael and Anita are available for download, along with a couple of other items there. So please help yourself to that. And we'd like to share the results from the initial poll. Have you ever completed a survey from a public agency that asks sexual orientation or gender identity questions? Clearly, the majority of people have not, but actually, I'm happy to see that 30% said they have. I think this is some progress. And the second question: have you ever worked on a survey that asked sexual orientation or gender identity questions? Again, the majority no, to my expectation, but again, 30% that have. So we are not starting from zero, which is good, but I think there's more to be done. Thank you for that. And now I'd like to start with our panel discussion. If I could bring the panel members up, that'd be great. Our first question is really about, what can we do? And so currently no law exists at the federal level mandating the collection of sexual orientation and gender identity data, and only 4 states have narrower laws mandating LGBTQ inclusive data collection. The LGBTQ Data Inclusion Act, first introduced in 2016 and currently in Congress, would require federal agencies that collect information through a survey that includes demographic data to review existing data sets to determine in which data sets information about sexual orientation and gender identity is not included, and to assess needed changes in survey methods related to asking questions on sexual orientation and gender identity. So what more can transportation planners do to ensure that LGBTQ travelers feel seen, heard, and represented, and that their needs are being met?
Maren, why don't I jump in on that one? You kind of, I guess, started out with saying that there are no mandates. That kind of means to me that no one's telling me to do it, but I could do it. We're doing surveys all the time. Part of the cost with collecting the data is figuring out how those different choices that showed up on Anita's focus groups fits into the tools that we have, the instruments. We basically have these little boxes, right? Surveys are not the greatest in terms of getting at certain types of details. How do we do it in ways that are consistent? So if places that are doing surveys now would start asking these questions, and there's not a standard way of doing it, but I think we need to kind of experiment. We're not going to get it right for the first time maybe, but places with resources, and my agency is one of them, where if we're doing surveys coming up, I think we should experiment with it, get consultants help exchange information with other, and see what information that we can get. It's like the race and ethnicity questions, right? There's not just one question that can neatly get all the information that we can get. We need to think about the trade-offs and how we could succinctly and clearly communicate with people. But also, I think if it's not just about getting the data itself, and even if we accept that the percent is 5 or 6%, making sure that we don't have inherent biases, because if people are filling out these surveys and feel like this survey doesn't represent them, or they're not part of this effort, part of the planning world, part of whatever it is that we're trying to do, we're losing that information regardless of how big that population is. So I think making sure that people feel engaged and be included as part of our planning processes is one of the key things that I think we should be doing.
I'd like to add on what Brian said, and I think as far as focusing that is actually working with LGBTQ advocacy organizations. You know, here in Oregon, Basic Rights Oregon was the one who helped initiate a lot of the legislation, and engaging with them on you know, what are those categories? How do you create those? Some of the resources that I shared through the Oregon Health Authority and their Office of Equity that has kind of draft questionnaire. They did that through engagement with the community. A lot of it is, you know, some of the stuff, at least in Oregon, is related to some of the rulemaking. But I think that is where you're going to get not only kind of the categories, but buy-in from the community as well to understand why you're collecting this, why it's important. And then those folks can serve as ambassadors as well.
Yeah, I can jump in. Yeah, RSG in the last few years has included more gender categories than just male and female. We were already including gender and just opened that question up to more categories and also prefer not to answer. A problem there is that we don't really know how accurate that data is, and we have to weight the data to census data, which only has male, female. So maybe the census will start including more categories, although I just read an article from that was in the papers, like the LA Times this Sunday, saying that in this year's 2020 census, questions like gender, relationships within the household were getting really high non-response, like over 10% non-response, whereas in the past that's only been maybe 2 or 3%, which means maybe people aren't willing to answer those questions much, at least to the Census Bureau. In terms of sexual preference, that or sexual orientation, yeah, as Brian said, I think we need to experiment some with that. I can imagine some people saying, why are you asking me this on a travel survey? and not wanting to answer the survey, whereas some people may appreciate being asked. So it's that's a tough one.
It is. I'd like to shift slightly and ask about transportation impacts for LGBTQ populations. These are generally measured with surveys of travel behavior and mobility that include demographic characteristics. So what are the barriers to adding these questions on sexual orientation and gender identity questions at any level, federal, state, or regional?
I guess I can jump in on that one. I think Mark brought up an important point, and the fact that there's so much non-response in some of these questions is telling. That there may be, and I suspect there is, little trust in different levels of government using the data correctly, wisely, protecting anonymity and so forth, and just a reluctance. I think we see this across the board, sort of a reluctance to share what seems to be private information with government. And I think that doesn't have to be that way, right? I mean, we can, through partnerships with community groups or through extensive outreach, can sort of change the narrative around this, that we're asking questions about sexual orientation and gender identity because we sort of care about the problems that people are facing. I think that's probably going to be more successful in some places than in others, and with different partnerships than with others. And I don't think there's any one way forward with it. So you all know your regions better than I do. But I think that's the main problem that we face, I think.
So maybe I'll add to what Michael was saying about that outreach, because that's a longer journey than adding a question or two on a survey, right? But I think maybe we make an assumption maybe in this discussion that when we say data, it means surveys, it means census. But I think as Anita kind of demonstrated, data can come in qualitative forms, and parts of those outreach, part of the way that we triangulate is that we experiment with the survey instruments that are systematic, and then we also have systematic qualitative ways to build connections and collect information at the same time. And perhaps over a longer period, we'll reach a place where when the census does it, and if we see that as like the highest achievement in data collection, then we might have some gold standard as a goal towards the end. But before we get there, I think we need to kind of figure out a lot of different tools on our tool belt to kind of access and gain more information.
And I had something to add. Thank you for that, Ryan, because also I have to say, just because of not only the pandemic, but also with the addition of kind of racial violence and tension in the Black community, in the Asian community as well, really, the data you collect is only as good as the data you collect it. So I think the validation of focus groups regionally and being more intentional about it is really important, because just over the last year and a half, the work I've done in our region here in the Portland metro area, we have a lot of data, but it was all pre-pandemic. And so, engaging with communities of color and other folks, their travel behavior has significantly changed. So I think there's an important qualitative piece as well, that it's, and especially now with climate change, things are changing as well, heat waves and other sorts of things. So there's a lot of things going on in community that folks are dealing with.
Yeah, so I'm going to pivot here slightly and focus on equity. Equity analysis across the country is gaining a lot of visibility and importance in the planning context. So LGBTQ populations have not been represented in equity analysis that we're aware of in the US currently. What research do you think we need to encourage agencies to account for LGBTQ population needs in their planning and modeling activities?
Well, the issue of safety and harassment is one that usually isn't considered in equity analysis, but as Michael and Anita both mentioned, and we also found in a New York City DOT survey, I think about 80% of people who identified as non-binary said they had experienced harassment, sometimes violent harassment, during their travels. So, it's hard to, a lot of times equity analysis wants to put things in dollar values, and it's hard to put a dollar value on things like that. So
it is, and currently safety is being used as a metric to evaluate at the end of the process, and not one that's affecting people's choices, right?
Right.
And even the term safety, if you saw from our focus group on who is making that decision on what is safety. And, they said a white woman's perception on safety is much different. I mean, one of the transmasculine folks I interviewed said basically women are intimidated by them because they're a little bit gender ambiguous, and just by looking at them, and mostly white women, they said. So, I think it's really important to kind of look at the intersectionality, but then what are also some of the more unique situations. And in this focus group said the non-binary, trans, people of color in particular are really the ones that are most, they're being murdered every day. They're out in public. And so I think looking at not only the intersectionality, but who are the most impacted by their travel behavior and safety out in their communities and focus on that. And then you can tease some other sorts of things out, because really, as they say, you know, if you look at that, you end up floating all boats by looking at the folks that are most impacted.
Great. Well, apparently we have a fair number of questions, so I'm going to shift the panel discussion and take some of the questions from the participants. Amanda, do you want to read off one of the questions?
Sure, yeah. So one of the questions said, is there any evidence that there is a difference in the transportation needs and preferences for LGBT?
Guess I can take that. We certainly see, as I showed, major differences in the realized travel behavior, so how people actually are getting around, the amount of travel, the distances traveled, the modes used. It's hard to say whether that really rests upon some sort of preference. And I think for a lot of the questions we might want to ask about LGBTQ populations and travel, maybe it doesn't matter so much whether this is preference or just, you know, living in a place where things you want to go to are nearby, you know, and so you may not have an innate preference for transit, but it just sort of makes sense because you're going to places that are nearby. So, and I don't remember what the other word used was, but I don't think we don't have a lot of evidence at the root causes of the quite stark differences in travel behavior. And I think this is, again, I want to echo what Brian said, that that we need Anita to do a lot more of these focus groups, that's really how we get at some of these, the causal narrative, right? Why are things different? We know things are different, but why is a big question. There could be push and pull factors. It could be people are traveling in certain ways because they're terrified of traveling other ways, for example. We don't know. So that'll be my initial answer, at least.
Yeah, I agree. I think we need better data that really identifies the differences where you don't have to impute everything, and also maybe some more in-depth sort of attitudinal research that gets more at people's reasons for why they're making decisions. Because especially for forecasting models, you know, you don't know if something's going to persist into the future unless you know why it's happening, right?
So I think I just want to zoom out a little bit too, because I think that question and many of our kind of planning efforts are focused on in silos, right? But if you're truly wanting to understand if there are preferences in travel, for example, you might need to zoom out and kind of think about, are there patterns of differences in terms of how people live their lives, choosing where they live, choosing where they work, are there certain constraints, how those things all interact with each other, and then asking all sorts of why questions, right? Getting down to the root causes of equity. Why are there these differences, and how do they kind of relate to each other and impact each other? So transportation is one big piece of it, but it's integrated with all these other life decisions. And until we have like a bigger picture, it's kind of hard to kind of zoom into like one part of it.
Agreed. Amanda, do you want to start with another question?
Sure. So another question I wanted to make sure to get to is, I would like to hear the panel elaborate on any findings they've made on how to improve the response rates of the LGBTQ plus community members.
I can go. I think it's engaging with the LGBTQ community, finding trusted leaders and relationships that can help one shape those questions, also administer those as well, because that's, I think, really important to get folks in. And also it's your, I guess it's your communication strategy. You know, how are you going to tell them why this is important and what you're going to do with this, and what sort of accountability are you going to have as a government agency in particular on what you're going to do with that. So and it has to be more relational than transactional, and that also goes along with working with communities of color and disability communities. Trust for them to trust, to know that, you know, that there's somebody there that is, one, that they feel safe sharing this information, that it's confidential, and then the other one is, what are they going to do with this, and how is this really going to make a difference in my life, or at least in the community on a larger scale.
All right, Amanda, I think we have time for a couple more.
Yeah, so one of the ones that just came in said, I've seen the use of location-based services data from smartphones in the context of scandals, e.g. outing priests for being on Grindr and going to gay bars. Are there data products that are more sensitive to privacy or safer that could be useful to researchers and planners?
I can talk on this one. I haven't tried for a long time because everyone just keeps saying no to me, but I've tried to find ways to safely and conscientiously use data that are location based from services like Grindr, or you can just imagine Facebook knows everything about everyone and knows where they live and how many cars they have and so forth. So I would say the answer to that is, yeah, there's definitely great data out there that would help us tremendously. I've at least had no success in gaining access to it. And I think I could go on and on about, if you use Facebook data, who's excluded and who's not telling Facebook certain things about themselves, and you get all kinds of bias introduced into there. So again, it's interesting and I could write some papers off of it. And I think we would all be a little bit smarter if I did that. But the gold standard is the route that we've been talking about, which is building trust in the community through engagement, through focus groups, through communicating that this is a real, that we are compassionate and sincere about addressing issues in travel among LGBTQ population, and then collecting data.
Yeah, I don't know if it's so much of an issue for the big data, LBS data, because I think most people don't even know that they're providing that data.
Yeah.
Just from all kinds of apps on your phone. But but I think, yeah, the social media type data, mining that type of data seems pretty sensitive and also hard to sort of generalize that kind of data to the population.
Very much so. Okay, Amanda, maybe one more?
Yeah, so one more, it's hard to pick a final one. There are so many great questions. Have any of you studied the transportation needs of LGBTQ plus people, especially youth experiencing homelessness? No.
I have not, but if anyone wants to do that, you can come work with me, be my doctors.
I've actually held a couple focus groups with LGBTQ youth, actually in homeless shelters. And, during COVID, they would borrow somebody's phone, and we did some focus groups. Again, some of the best practices, giving them a stipend. So, for the hour, we gave them $25. And some of them were on the street, some were living in shelters or with other folks, but these we call youth as under 24 years of age. We worked with some of the youth services in Washington County. It was the project I worked on in particular. And talk to them not only about the challenges they have as far as homeless services, what sort of policies, but how do they travel around as well. But I don't think there's any been like big data surveys. But again, focus groups definitely will give you at least an idea of the experiences that these folks are living and the challenges. So,
yeah, I think that could be a topic for a whole nother webinar, because homeless people aren't really represented in travel surveys, right? Even ones who live in vehicles and RVs and things.
I wanted to get in one last question, and so okay, great. There are a few that came in early on. I'm sorry we can't get to all the questions, but this one was to Michael specifically, and that is, are the LGBTQ plus travel behavior observations normalized for non-LGBTQ plus people in the same neighborhoods?
I can sort of interpret that question in two different ways. I'm going to answer both of them because I don't know exactly what was meant. If by normalize you mean, is it looking at neighborhoods as a sort of concentration of LGBTQ population? So what percent of the population is willing to tell the census that they have a partner who's of the same sex? Yes, that's how we're doing it. So that's sort of normalized in one way. It's not a count of people, it's a share of the population. The other way that question might be getting at is, are we comparing apples and apples, basically? So are we controlling for a lot of things that we think are important in our statistical analyses? And nobody's ever perfect in this. I think we do a pretty good job of trying to compare a gay couple to their similarly situated neighbors living right next door to them who have the same income, the same number of children, the same number of cars, you know. So we're controlling for a lot of things. If that's what normalization means there, I hope to think that we do a good job of that, but I'm sure there are omitted variables that are very important, right? That we just didn't have access to or weren't smart enough to think about, maybe.
Okay, thank you to all the panelists. I want to bring up the final poll that we have. We have 2 additional questions. Have you ever worked on a project that conducted specific outreach to the LGBTQ community as part of public engagement process? So I'll leave that up there for a minute or so. Okay, thank you for that. The second, oh, here's the results. Excellent. So a much bigger majority of 89% have not worked on a project that conducted outreach to this community. And I think this just confirms what we all knew in our minds, that it's not, you know, it's a big gap in the certainly on the outreach side of things. And the final question is, how likely are you to consider adding sexual orientation and gender identity questions to any existing or new surveys in the near future? Okay. Well, this is great. Very likely and likely, 65% of the audience. And nobody said unlikely or very unlikely, which is good. I concur with Michael's idea that if you're here, you're interested in the topic. So I think that bears out somewhat of a biased sample, but I think this is really encouraging that there's enough of us out there that want to see this gap in research and data be filled. Okay, I want to thank everyone for your participation today. We hope that by highlighting this gap in our understanding of the LGBTQ community transportation planning needs, that we can begin addressing these needs by counting all our communities. A recorded copy of this webinar will be shared with attendees after the event, and you will also receive a short survey for the webinar, and we hope you can share any feedback that you may have. Thanks again for attending, and a special thanks to our panelists. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.